Well, first off, I'd like to thank everybody for coming here tonight. Apparently there's a football game. Who knew? Well, before I start the talk, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Scott Tinker with switchon.org. A lot of my talk is derived from some of the work he did, and I encourage you to visit his website. Off. On. Ta-da! Now, you know, there was a time you used to think that was magic. Somewhere between the ages of 2 and 3, you discovered the light switch. And you drove your parents crazy going on, off, on, off. For those of your grandparents, you find this highly amusing. But you turned 3. You were older. You were more mature. You were toilet trained. And you took the light switch for granted. Just like we all take the light switch for granted. But what if you were right all along? What if the light switch really was magic? Well, I'd like to start this talk with a quiz. We're gonna, I got energy experts out here, right? We're gonna see how good you really are. Okay, how many watt hours of energy does the average American man, woman, and child use every year? Okay, show of hands. A, B, come on, I need some audience participation here. Okay, C, D, or E? Give that woman a cigar. Linda's the only one who got it right. Each American man, woman, and child uses over 100 million watt hours of electricity a year. This is actually easy to figure out. You can go to the EIA website and they have the total amount of energy that the U.S. uses. You divide that by the population. That's about 94 million watt hours per year. Well, does anybody own something that was made in Asia?
Oh, yeah.
Well, everything that's made in Asia has to be manufactured, transported, marketed, and sold. And that takes energy. In fact, if we look at the world, every man, woman, and child in the world uses 20 million watt hours per year. That includes Bill Gates, and that includes a child in Biafra. So the question is, why is that number so big? And the answer is that energy is in everything we do. Since you didn't do so well in the first questions, I'm going to ask some questions a little bit easier. Do you eat food? Yeah. Okay, I think you guys got that one. Well, food for a family of 4 for a week takes the energy equivalent of 22 gallons of gasoline to grow, market, transport, and sell. Okay. Do you wear clothes? Well, everybody here's got a pair of blue jeans. Every pair of blue jeans that you own will take the energy equivalent of 3 gallons of gasoline to create the raw materials, manufacture, transport, sell, and wash. We all take energy for granted. I mean, we think about the energy we use in our car because we go to the gas station and it goes ding, 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 and we watch it fill up. But we don't think about the energy that's used to make the car. We don't think about the energy that's used to build and maintain the road. Well, if energy is in everything we do, then the cost of energy is in everything we do. And most decisions made on energy worldwide are made based on cost. Cost will affect every part of the economy, and increases in the cost of energy hit the poor the hardest. So what we have is what Scott Tinker calls the 3 E's: energy, economy, and the environment. They're inextricably linked. We can't affect one E without affecting the other. When we think of energy, a lot of discussions on CO2, but there's also When we think of the environment, a lot of discussions on CO2, which is also land use, water, and air quality. As far as the economy, obviously poverty is a great issue. But we also have economic competition. Bernie Schaefer and Donald Trump agree on exactly one thing, and that is we are economic competitors with China. Now, a lot of the discussion with energy has been based on fossil fuels versus renewables, but nuclear has a valuable part to add as well. And indeed, energy fuels our world. The reason nobody was really impressed with the magic trick is you live here. But what's going on here? There's 1 billion people in Africa, and it's dark. Well, what we see is that there's a direct relationship between energy poverty and poverty. And we can look at third world countries to demonstrate that. Okay, if you look at Latin America is 100% electrified. And you can see there's very little poverty. And you can see how we're defining poverty. Less than $3.10 a day. That's a UN definition. Asia's a little bit spread out. You can see obviously China's quite prosperous. India we're going to talk about in the next slide. But look at sub-Saharan Africa. We see high levels of poverty and low levels of electrification. In fact, you can almost draw a straight line between poverty and electricity. Now, I told you we were going to talk about India. India is an amazing story. In the year 2000, 2/3 of the homes in India were without electricity. Now, 20 years later, they're down to 31 million homes. And that's in a country of 1.25 billion people. It's been an amazing accomplishment by the Indian government. And look what's happened to their economy. Here's 2000. You can see GDP went parabolic. In fact, GDP has tripled. Per capita GDP has tripled in 20 years. If energy poverty equals poverty, then energy prosperity equals prosperity. Well, what does energy poverty prove? Well, some of these things are obvious. Hunger. Obviously you can use a tractor to plow the field instead of oxen. Clean water. You can drill a well and pump water out of the well instead of getting from a polluted river.
Sewers in the streets.
Yeah, but what do I mean by clean cooking? Well, in the West, we cook with gas or electric. But what if you don't have gas or electricity? You cook with what's available. Now, if there's firewood available, you cook with firewood. And actually, a lot of places in Africa, the people have respiratory problems because you got smoke. They're cooking inside. But what if there's no firewood? What do you use then? You use what's available. And what's available is animal and human waste. And there are large areas of Africa and parts of Asia where the dominant fuel for cooking is human waste. Now, I want to draw you a picture. You're out at your lake house. It's a beautiful view in background. And you're sitting in front of a campfire, and there's a juicy steak cooking over an open poop fire. Doesn't that smell appetizing? Some of the other things are obvious: education, healthcare. Birth rates in many African countries are very, very high, but so are child mortality rates. I mean, they may have 10 kids, and 5 of them will live. We get electricity, we get improved healthcare, and birth rates and child mortality rates both go down. The other one was kind of a surprise for me. When countries get electrified, women at a 3-to-1 ratio to men start new micro businesses. Who knew? So what if we could light up Africa? What if you had never seen your friends or your family at night except by firelight? Now you do. Wouldn't that be magic? So what does an energy source need to be? It needs to be affordable. Energy that's not affordable is not sustainable. Government subsidies can make it temporarily affordable, but you can't keep subsidies going forever. It has to be available. Some sources of energy are easily transportable. Oil, coal, gas, huge transportation infrastructure. Other sources are not. Has to be reliable. You have to be able to, and if we look at wind and solar, wind only works when the wind blows, solar only works when the sun shines. Those are intermittent sources. And of course, different levels of energy provide different levels of pollution. The key is that there is no perfect energy source. All of them have pluses and minuses. So and today, we live in a fossil fuel world. Okay, you can see renewables sit right at about 4%. 89% of all energy in the world comes from fossil fuels. So let's go through some of those energy sources and talk about how they're used. Oil is dominantly used for transportation. So you can see 93.5% of the energy used for transportation is oil. And in the US, 99% of light-duty fuel consumption is gasoline. We use it because it works. If we look here at battery power, for example, you can see that you don't get a lot of power for the weight of the batteries. That's improving, but we still have a long way to go. Gas sources like hydrogen are lighter, but they're not as efficient. Gasoline and diesel really are at the sweet spot here. Got an earthquake. And so I'd like to acknowledge the humble gallon of gas. You can walk around with it in your hand, and yet that little gallon of gas can take a family of 4, 50 miles in comfort, traveling at a mile a minute. That's pretty incredible. Now, if we look at auto sales, everybody's talked, we can see, looking in the future, auto sales in the US, Europe are relatively stable. But look what's happening in China. You can see that as China has become electrified and it's become more prosperous, and people have bought cars. Watch India. India's next. There's 1.25 billion people in India that all know what a car is, and they want one. And as they become more prosperous, they're going to start buying them. Tata Motors, great stock investment. Now, we heard a lot about electric cars, and electric cars are more efficient in terms of CO2 emissions than gasoline cars. You can see that the Prius, which is probably the most efficient gas car, puts out about 19 pounds CO2 per 50 miles. The Tesla Model 3 puts out about 14 and a half. But there's a huge infrastructure for gasoline. We're really never more than, in Houston, 5 or 10 minutes from a gas station. And we're on the road, we really don't have to worry about a gas station. Now, if you only have 110 volt, it takes 4 days to completely charge a Tesla Model 3. If you've got a house and you can bring in 240 volts, you can do it in about 6 to 30 hours, depending on the amperage. 20 amps obviously takes a lot longer than 80 amps. There are charging stations out there, and they take as little as 30 minutes. But there's exactly 21 charging stations in the greater Houston area. And if you got 4 cars, and sometimes only one charging unit. So you got 4 cars in front of you, it's a 2-hour wait. The other thing is, not everybody lives in homes. Both my kids live in apartments, and they may park anywhere 300-400 feet away from their apartment door, and they park in different places every night. Is it really practical for them to run a 400 or 500 foot extension cord out to their car at night? What you find out is electric cars are basically bought by affluent people, many of whom own more than one car. Average income in the United States is $59,000, family income. Average family income of a Tesla owner is $143,000. And of course, more electric cars means more mining. This cell phone has one lithium-ion battery in it. Anybody know how many are in a Tesla Model S? 7,000.
Well, they use batteries like that?
Yes, they do. They use series of,
Big, massive batteries.
they use small batteries. And does anybody think mining is green? Well, let's investigate that in more detail.
Yeah, really.
Over 50% of the cobalt in the world comes from one country, the Congo. And there are mechanized mines in the Congo, but there are what people call artisanal mines. Where, and I can hear, and they actually are green. I can hear the press release now. Welcome to Despot Mines. We operate our mines without use of any fossil fuels whatsoever. All of our cobalt is mined by hand by highly trained young artisans using the latest in 5th century technology. Now, there's a lot of NGOs in the Congo, and they're very concerned about the welfare of the Congolese. So you would think they'd want to shut these mines down, right? You'd be wrong. The Congo is so mired in dire poverty that these mines, these artisanal mines, are a valuable source of income for people. You want to know what energy poverty looks like? That's what energy poverty looks like. Well, let's switch to electricity. One of the most important things about electricity is it's the only commodity that's consumed the moment it's created. People talk about storing electricity. Well, to store the electricity that the US uses in one day would take the entire output of the Tesla Gigafactory for 500 years. It just can't, it's a nice thought, but we're clearly not there. And if we look at electricity in the US, about a little less than 2/3 of electricity comes from coal and natural gas. You can see we're about 35% natural gas, about 27% coal. If we look at the world, pretty much the same thing. Largely, except the world uses a far greater amount of coal. In both the world and US numbers, about 8% of energy is renewables. And that's largely wind and solar. So let's take a look at some of these energy sources. Coal is affordable, available, and reliable. It's the most abundant and cheapest energy source in the world. It's the easiest to mine and process. So it's the energy source of choice for developing countries. Coal use has increased 5 times in Asia in the past 30 years. And in fact, China uses over 50% of the energy that comes from coal is used in China. China has about 993 gigawatts of current coal-fired energy capacity, and they're adding another 300 plus plants. They'll add another 259 gigawatts. The U.S. currently has 244 gigawatts, and it's come down from 317, largely because of the economic advantages of natural gas. And of course, coal produces more carbon than any other fuel source. Now, natural gas is abundant, affordable, and reliable. We've got a very efficient transportation structure, and it produces about 58% of the CO2 that coal does. It's a very clean burning fuel. Now, we hear a lot of talk about methane emissions, but according to the EIA and the EPA, they've decreased by 24% as production of gas has increased by 19% and oil by 65%. And natural gas has been the key factor in the reduction of overall U.S. carbon emissions since 2005. Now, when we look at methane, we can see, according to the EPA, about 31% of methane comes from petroleum and natural gas systems. But that's only 1.4% of the total global methane. So we've got to ask a couple questions. Methane's only resident in the atmosphere for 10 years. Then it decays to water and carbon dioxide. Should the perfect be the enemy of the good? Now, at this point, I need a volunteer. I need somebody to ask me what enteric fermentation is.
What's enteric?
Thank you. I thought you never asked. It's cow farts. Actually, it's not quite correct. It's cow farts, sheep farts, and goat farts, and horse farts. Now, deer farts are not included. Deer farts are natural farts. So it turns out AOC was right all along. Who knew? Now, this is a brand new slide, and this is something I just found out about, and it's quite exciting. Okay. Carbon sequestration has been a pipe dream for a lot of people, for a long time. The problem is it effective, if you try to capture carbon at the smokestack, and we know how to do it, it effectively doubles the cost of electricity. So there's a plant in LaPorte right now that has kind of totally changed the game. They're actually capturing and using the carbon as part of the process of generating electricity. What most power plants basically heat up water, and water creates steam, and the steam pump powers the turbines. Here what they're doing is they're using oxygen to actually heat up the CO2, which under enough pressure turns into a supercritical liquid, using that supercritical liquid to then power the turbine. And it turns out they're getting about 10% more efficiency in terms of electricity generation than you get from steam. Now, since they're already capturing it, we don't have to pay the additional cost of capture. All we have to do is pay the cost of sequestration. And, we're pretty good in the oil business at pumping fluids back into the ground, be it an EOR, like a CO2 injection, or putting water back putting wastewater back into the system. We know how to do that. And it's a lot cheaper to sequester CO2 than it is to capture it. Actually, right now, the plant in LaPorte is selling their CO2, and they're also selling nitrogen and argon that are created as byproducts of the oxygenation process. Well, what if we had a magic rock? And this little magic rock could power a small city or an aircraft carrier for 25 years with no pollution whatsoever. Guess what? We have that rock. It's called nuclear power. Nuclear power has it all. It's affordable, available, reliable, it's clean. There's no pollution at all. There are obviously long-term issues with storage, nuclear waste, and there are some countries that we really don't want to have nuclear power. But if you look at France, France is the largest energy exporter, not only in Europe, as it says here, but in the world. And they get 75% of their energy from nuclear power. They've actually solved the storage problem. They recycle 96% of the fissionable material. Now, anybody know when the last nuclear power plant was permitted? 1978. Anybody know what happened in 1979? 3 Mile Island, exactly. And that really shut down a lot of the nuclear power plants. Now, there have been 2 expansions since then, both quite recently, of existing plants. And there's a small plant that's working its way through the permitting process right now. But basically, we're shutting down our nuclear plants. 3 Mile Island actually shut down in September. Indian Point plant in New York, which supplies 12% of New York's electricity, is shutting down this year. Average nuclear power plant in the United States is 39 years old, and and they're ending their useful life. The ones in France are obviously newer, safer, and far, far better. And you can see France will be the first country, major country, to get all their electricity from zero carbon emission sources, and that's largely nuclear. They're only getting about 6% of electricity right now from coal and natural gas. Hydropower is great where you have it, but we don't all live in Washington State or nowhere. Hydropower requires steep gradient rivers and lots of rain, and that doesn't happen everywhere. Now you can build dams, but dams also create environmental issues of their own. Biomass is probably the biggest scam going. What you hear about the promoters of biomass is, well, this tree produces all this oxygen, so when you burn it, it produces CO2, but it's a zero-sum game. There's so many things wrong with that statement, it would take me another hour to explain it. But the biggest thing is that if a tree decays naturally, all the carbon does not get oxidized. A large portion of it gets recycled into the carbon system by microbes, insects, fungus, etc., that are a natural part of the decay process. And even the stuff doesn't get recycled, you pick up dirt, you have humus. That's organic material that's being stored as reduced carbon. The other thing is, it takes 20 years to grow a tree. It takes what, 30 seconds to burn it? And sooner or later, you run out of trees. And what people aren't telling you is that biomass puts the same amount of CO2 in the atmosphere as coal, along with a lot of pollutants. In fact, there are several papers that suggest about 25% of the anthropogenic warming in the U.S. is a function of deforestation and burning of biomass. Well, I'm going to talk about wind and solar.
When you say deforestation, do you mean for human use, or do you mean for just cutting down trees for clearing and that?
All deforestation, yeah. Okay. I'm going to talk about wind and solar in the same category because they both have the same advantages and they both have the same disadvantages. They're clean. There's no pollution associated with them. But they're more expensive than other sources, even with government subsidies. And remember, subsidies are not sustainable forever. Sooner or later, every energy source has to compete in the market. Both are intermittent sources. Wind only works when the wind blows. Solar only works when the sun shines. But one of the most important things is they both require a very large footprint and low-value real estate. And since the low-value real estate exists far from population centers, you've got to build infrastructure to get that energy from the middle of nowhere to that population center. So let's look at solar. How big does a solar plant need to power Greater Houston? Well, I actually calculated that. I used the Ivanpah plant in the Mojave Desert as an example. Ivanpah plant is 3,600 acres in size, and it supplies electricity to 140,000 households. Well, Greater Houston has 2.3 million households, and solar radiation is less. And I also looked at the fact that residential use is about 38% of total electricity use. So the answer to that question is about 403 square miles. Now I live here. I'm okay. While you guys live here, you're gonna have to move. What about wind? Well, I don't have to go to California to talk about wind. Texas has 25% of the wind energy in the United States. Like it or not, we got a lot of hot air in Texas. And so I looked at the Buffalo Gap Wind Farm, which is one of the largest wind farms in Texas. It's got a nameplate capacity of about 523 megawatts. Now, what do I mean by nameplate capacity? That means when all the wind turbines are running full blast, it'll produce 523 megawatts. But that doesn't happen all the time. So it turns out the average electricity it provides is about one-third capacity, or about 174 megawatts. And so what that means is that it's basically providing electricity for about 58,500 households. Now the problem is, as everybody knows who's lived in Texas, and we've all lived here for a while, sometimes the wind blows and sometimes it doesn't. July, August, and September, there's a high pressure system that sits over much of central Texas. And it does two things. One is it gets really, really hot. And two, the wind stops blowing. The result is that in 2019, we had a severe electricity shortage. And ERCOT, who regulates electricity in Texas, had to go out and buy electricity on the spot market. Well, it's kind of a little bit like a drug deal. You want it? Well, hey, you got to pay the price, right? Average price for electricity on market is $20 to $30 a megawatt. ERCOT had to pay prices as high as $9,000 a megawatt. Wind wasn't blowing. My cousin lives in Boston, bless her heart, and she says, Jory, I'd live near, right next to a wind turbine. And I said, Sue, evidently, you've never heard a wind turbine. Wind turbine running full blast produces 110 decibels. That's roughly the same as a Learjet. She didn't think living next to a Learjet going full blast was a good idea. And there's actually been health issues associated with people living near wind turbines. So you've got to put them out in the middle of nowhere. But the thing is that wind requires even more acreage. For that 58,000 households, okay, we need 108 square miles, or about 69,000 acres. I mean, we need over an acre per person, or per household, I'm sorry, to power communities by wind. And there's just not enough land around. And of course, not everybody wants these in their backyard. Permitting high tension lines is extremely difficult, time consuming, and you get a lot of community opposition. So it's not a simple matter simply to build a wind farm and then transport electricity 1,000 miles to where it's needed. And you get transmission loss. Everybody knows on high tension lines the wires dip. Well, they're not put in like that. They're put in straight and flat. They're taut. But what happens is that as they heat up, the metal expands. And that heat's caused by resistance, and that's transmission loss. In the US, we have about an average of 7% transmission loss. So that's 7% electricity that we're producing, but is not being seen by the user. Longer the transmission lines, the more the transmission loss. Well, what about rooftop solar? Okay, well, I basically said, okay, what's it going to cost me to get 50% of solar energy for my house? And I said 50% because I don't have a big enough roof for 100%. And so what I did is, okay, I went a couple websites. They want to sell me solar panels. And it turns out that the cost will be right around $45,500. Now my actual cost will be $35,000 because the government will give me a $10,500 check. So I can either pay $325 a month, which is my average electricity bill, or I can pay half that, which is the $162.50, plus the monthly payment on that 20-year loan for $35 grand. I did 20 years because that's the lifetime of a solar panels and most roofs. Now, I didn't include the maintenance, yearly maintenance, but I can tell you what, I'm not getting on top of my house and washing off those panels. I got to pay somebody to do it. If I lived in Hawaii, where electricity is 27 cents a kilowatt instead of 9.7 cents, it might be worth it. Or if I wanted to put them up myself, it might be worth it. So it could work in some areas. But let's talk about this number here, this $10,500 check the government will give me. I'm an affluent guy. I've had a very successful career in the oil business. I don't even need to take a loan. I can write a $35,000 check. So, but not everybody is affluent. So I want to show of hands. How many think the best use of their taxpayer dollars is to give them to me? Nobody's raising their hands.
Sorry, Joey.
I'm just not getting a lot of love in this room. Yeah, I think we have to ask the question, is it moral to take money from people who don't earn a lot and give it to people who do? And, you know, I'm more than willing to accept free money, but I think we need to take a serious look at that as policy. Can we scale wind and solar? Well, today, wind and solar don't make up for the global growth in energy consumption. And perhaps, I'm sure you've heard this term, there's what Dave Lawrence called the creaming curve. It's talking about prospects. And that is we drill prospects in the best areas first. Well, it's the same with wind and solar. We build wind farms in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and we build solar energy plants in the desert in California. But as we add to those locations, they're going to be more expensive, the land's not always going to be as cheap, and they're going to be suboptimal. The other thing is that the sun and wind are renewable, but turbines, batteries, panels aren't. And in fact, NPR said that we're going to have to dispose of 720,000 tons of wind turbine blades in the next 20 years.
Or recycle them.
You really can't. So let's think about this statement again. If energy is in everything we do, the cost of energy is in everything we do. If we start moving towards an increase in wind and solar, knowing they're more expensive, somebody's going to have to bear the cost. Okay, and that somebody will be the U.S. consumer and the U.S. taxpayer. And again, you know, if you're Tom Steyer or Bloomberg, you know, you're probably not going to notice the cost. But if you're a single mom in the 4th Ward and your electricity bill goes up by 30, 40%, you will notice it. So the real question is, should we subsidize China? If we go increase the cost of our energy and China doesn't, and if the cost of energy is in everything we do, then China's products become more competitive. In fact, one of the biggest advantages we have as a country, our workforce is more expensive than China's, but our energy is cheaper. If we take that away, we do damage to our economy. It's that simple. And China has no intention of cutting back on coal use. They're building 300 new plants. And when you build a coal plant, you're looking 30, 40 years in the future. You're not doing it as a political exercise. One of the things we have to understand is if we talk about global warming, it's anthropogenic global warming. It's not anthropogenic U.S. warming. And in fact, you can see that our carbon emissions have basically remained stable for 40 years. They've come down 14% since 2005, but if you look where the increased carbon is, it's all coming from China. Now, India is going to shortly follow. 60% of that electricity revolution we saw in India comes from coal. And Pramod Modi was pretty upfront when he was asked about moving towards low carbon sources. No, basically said no, our country's too poor. We made a huge investment in getting everybody electrified using coal, and we're going to continue to. Pretty much said that. And so what does that mean? Well, you know, once people have electricity, they're going to use it. Well, the question is, will people support an increase in energy costs? If you look at the polls, the newspapers are full of polls saying there's broad support for renewable energy. 75% support renewable energy. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, do you support motherhood? Yeah, I kind of sort of do. I could only find 2 polls where they asked the question, would you pay for it? And fortunately, I found a conservative poll, and I found a liberal poll. The conservative poll is Rasmussen. Rasmussen tends to, if you take a look at their polls, they tend to lean on the conservative side. Basically, when they asked, would you pay more, 55% said no. 21% said yes, it was less than $100 a year, and you saw what my solar bill would be for just half of it, way more than $100 a year. And only 14% said yes. Now, here's the liberal poll, Yale. Then you can see they interviewed 48% Democrats and 36% Republicans. And you can see this when you look at the sample, more people would pay for it, but not much more. 47 versus 55% is not that big a difference. But when you normalize it for Democrats and Republicans, you can see that suggested by the independents, numbers are pretty much the same. The U.S. won't, people in the U.S. don't want to pay more for energy. And if you look at the riots, both in France and Iran recently, they're all based on one thing, increased energy costs. So let's kind of take a look at where we're at. Right now, we're using 89% fossil fuels. In fact, you can't even see solar on this graph here. Now, take a look at this little jump right here, right around 2000 or so. Well, as it turns out, IT, information technology, uses more energy than all but China and the US. So who's ready to give up their cell phones for the cause? I got a lot of groans when I gave that line at Ohio State.
I can't.
So energy consumption is going to continue to grow. The EIA predicts a 50% growth in energy between 2018 and 2015. And nearly all that growth will occur in Asia. A large portion, we saw India's continuing to grow, and so is China. China's economy, even though it's depressed relative to recent years, is still growing at 5-6% a year.
Is that based on population? Is that the driver for that?
No, it's economic growth. Population is part of it, but most of it's economic growth. I mean, our population is increasing more slowly, but we're using less energy. We're more efficient in our use of energy. China's not. Okay, India is not. And it's also based on increasing electrification. In India, 20 years ago, they didn't have electricity, so it didn't matter. Now they do. But population is important. You kind of led me to the next slide. Okay, we're seeing a population growth. And in fact, Africa will double in population by the year 2100. So if we look at energy, there actually is a pretty good correlation between population and energy growth. Like I say, it's spread unevenly because of Asia, but it's pretty good. Now, we're hearing various politicians say that we've got to be carbon-free by 2050, 2040. I think Elizabeth Warren's down to 2030. Well, let's see what that looks like. That looks like that. Does anybody think that's realistic? Certainly doesn't look realistic to me. So where are we at? Well, this all started with an inconvenient truth, so I'm going to talk about a couple other inconvenient truths. It's not technically possible to move to 100% carbon-free energy in the near future. It's not politically possible, and it's not economically possible. In my humble opinion, it's immoral to deny undeveloped countries and developing countries the advantages of energy prosperity that we have experienced all our lives and that we take for granted.
Do the advocates really recognize that?
Well, it really doesn't matter because China and India aren't going to do what we tell them to do. Okay? They're going to keep using coal because they want to have their economies grow. So it really doesn't matter what we do. And the developing countries can't afford to do anything else. And the other thing, of course, is energy consumption is going to rise by 50% by 2100. So what is realistic? Well, we are seeing use of foundational fuels, coal and oil, decrease in the developing world. They'll continue to decrease. Oil use is getting more efficient. Renewables are increasing but they can't reach a crossover between foundational fuels and renewables in the next 50 years. Just not going to happen. Just because people want it to happen, it's not going to happen. That crossover can occur, however, if we add transitional fuels, and that's natural gas and nuclear. It's going to require that we double natural gas, increase nuclear by 3 times, and increase renewables by 5 times. Now, Scott Tinker said that in 2012. And with the exception of nuclear, we've done it. We're doing it. The other thing, of course, is this Elm cycle technology. Okay, if we can bring the cost of carbon capture down to the point where all we're paying for is the sequestration, we get the best of both worlds. We can use the fossil fuels, and we can lower the carbon footprint. Here's what we shouldn't do. And I'll give you 3 examples, but there's more. New York governor refused permits for pipelines. And the pipeline company stopped hooking people up. And because they said they couldn't guarantee supply, which is a good reason not to have natural gas hookups. And Cuomo, in his infinite wisdom, said, no, you have to keep hooking people up. Well, what their plan is to transport that natural gas by truck. Okay? Well, not only is that going to be a whole bunch more carbon put in the atmosphere because it's going to take a lot of trucks, but has anybody heard of a blizzard in the Northeast? Now, some of you, precious few of you, are young enough that you weren't born in you weren't around in the energy crisis in 1973, 74. But some of us were. People froze. It was a serious deal. People froze. And then there's a blizzard, that's going to happen in New York. Keystone Pipeline. Well, we got to keep it in the ground. Well, guess what? You make a multi-billion-dollar investment, in building oil shale mines, you're not going to keep it in the ground. Kinder Morgan is building an expansion to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So instead of piping the oil down here, they're going to pipe it to ports in Vancouver. It's already being built. Then that oil will be transported by tanker to ports in the West Coast that are equipped for heavy oil refining and Asia. Again, what you've done is guarantee that there's going to be more CO2 emissions in the transportation process. Germany. Germany was the poster child for carbon reduction. It was dropping like a rock till about 2014. 2014, outlawed hydraulic fracturing, and they began decommissioning nuclear plants. Also made a huge investment in wind. Well, remember what we said earlier. The wind doesn't always blow. So what they've had to do is they've increased their coal consumption to make up for the energy shortages that they had when the wind didn't blow. So what's happened is, if you look at the graph, you can see their carbon was dropping quite steeply, then it levels off and it's actually starting to rise again. Well-intentioned policy does not always lead to the results you want. The other thing is a story not told, and that's U.S. energy efficiency. If we look at 1950 to 1970, we can look at energy growth associated with GDP. And if we continued on with that energy growth, we should see 180 quadrillion BTU of usage. But instead today, we're only using about 100 quadrillion. Every erg of energy not used is that much less carbon put into the air. And this is something we can export. This is something we do better than just about everybody. Those Allen Center plants, they're more efficient at energy conversion than coal plants. In fact, or gas plants. In fact, 60% of the energy created is wasted, largely through heat. Now, there's very little we can do about that. Thermodynamics is a bitch. But In the 1990s, they made technological increases. They've increased gas plant efficiency by 7%. And the Allen Center increases about 10%. So the more efficient our plants are, the more efficient we become in our use and creation of energy. So where are we at? Well, we're back to the 3 E's. We're sitting right around here. You go to university campus, they're sitting right around here. And we're mostly yelling and screaming at each other. Now, yelling and screaming can be can be kind of fun, but nothing gets done. Okay? What we have to do is talk about what Scott Tinker calls the radical middle, but what I call the rational middle. We have to look for solutions that are market-based. Now, you probably think that I'm giving you all a buy here, right? I mean, I'm an oil guy, you're oil guys. You're wrong. In 2008, I got sick of all the bullshit about carbon, CO2 on both sides of the spectrum, and I decided that I was going to start researching it. I said I was going to read 25 papers. Probably read over 200 papers. Anthropogenic warming is very well documented science. Argument is over. It's not a computer model. There's a huge amount of data, a huge amount. And we take ourselves out of the equation when we resist that. Understand what I mean. Energy experts are sitting in this room and nobody's listening to us because we're refusing to believe what is very well-defined science. So when I talk about meeting in that radical middle, we've got to get there too. Well, Greta Thunberg is, a very earnest young woman. Now, I wish my daddy bought me a $4.5 million racing yacht when I was 16. But, she honestly believes what she says. But she's not an energy expert. Ernie Moniz is. There was a movie back when I was in high school called The Loved Ones. It was about the funeral business. It had the best trailer ever. And the trailer said, there's something in this movie to offend everyone. So hopefully I've done with that with this talk. And hopefully I've started a discussion. Questions?
Any questions for Jory?
Yeah.
How do you get the oxygen cheaply for the Allen cycle?
Good question. They're getting some from Air Liquide, and they're creating some of and they're paying for that by selling the nitrogen and selling the argon, because there's actually a fair amount of demand for argon and nitrogen. So they're defraying some of that cost in that manner.
But it's not cheap or easy.
No, but like I say, if you look at the numbers, when you add in the income that they're getting for the argon, the nitrogen, and the CO2 that they're selling for EOR, which admittedly you can't do everywhere, they're getting their costs basically down to a level where they're cost competitive with wind and solar. That's pretty good. Okay, and that's including the sequestration, which is done by the EOR project. Are we there yet? Are we at a large scale implementation yet? No. But as costs come down with scale, and I'm quite optimistic that as they scale these things, and they're planning a 300 megawatt plant to open by 2024, that we can get those to a point where things are cost competitive.
And they're capturing our heat,
Yes.
which your third to last slide pointed out.
Yes. Yeah, they're more efficient. That's the other thing. Okay, you're looking at 40 to 47% efficiency with a natural gas, traditional natural gas electricity plant. You're looking at 62% efficiently with a supercritical CO2 plant. And that's a huge difference.
Please some of it.
Scott Tinker is producing actually a second film on energy poverty, and he talks about that exact issue. And so if you've got a little small isolated village, actually solar power works pretty well. So you don't need a lot of, you don't need a lot of electricity. But if you're looking at Nairobi, okay, you got millions of people, it's not gonna work at all. So I think that's an important point, that different populations require different solutions. Yeah,
Have you looked at what the effect would be on the electricity demand if, say, we converted all our gasoline-powered cars to electric cars? How much energy would be required to?
no, I haven't. Obviously, that'd be a huge increase, and it would obviously stress the system. That'd be an interesting calculation to make. I haven't made it.
But further to that, the biggest jump would be if we didn't just staple our houses and other buildings together. Because 80% of the improvement that we could do would be essentially through better building standards and insulation in the US. You know, we don't build stuff like Norway here. When you can sell or rent whatever you can staple together, there's no reason not to. So.
Well, there is a reason, and that's cost, okay? And so, we live in a capitalist system. We live in a free market. And so, you always have to ask, like in California, okay? There are all kinds of rules and regulations in California about building codes and energy efficiency. New homes have to have solar. The result is that the average home price in San Francisco is $1.62 million. Average home price in LA is a bargain at $829,000. So yes, we can go more efficient, but the result is now we have a situation where the middle class is essentially priced out. So there's always going to be a trade-off, and we always have to recognize that trade-off when you do any sort of city planning.
I think we can take one more question.
Okay,
I know
Mario,
a lot
you-
of people need to, and maybe Jory can stick around
Yeah, I can- yeah.
afterwards to.
Just, thank you. Just real quick, it seems that nuclear's biggest problem in the States is a PR issue, right, comparing it globally.
I would agree.
Are you aware of any initiatives by the government or any agencies to kind of start attacking that?
Well, there
You
is,
need to repeat the question for the rest of us.
Sure. The nuclear has a PR problem in the United States, and I was asking him if he's aware of any initiatives to kind of combat that.
well, the problem is that we live in a polarized society, to put it mildly, okay? And you're either on the red team or the blue team. And if you're on the red team, you're pro-nuclear power. If you're on the blue team, you're against nuclear power. Like I say, they're trying to push through permitting of a small, what they call modular nuclear power plant. I'm not sure, I just saw that recently. I don't know how far it's going, but that would be the first new plant as opposed to expansions of plants since 1978.